Well, March is finally here and postseason play gets started today as this is getting posted. The Big East tournament coming up. Welcome back to another edition of the Musketeer Madness podcast. No John Baldridge today, but we have a fan favorite at Xavier University at Xavier basketball. Everyone knows him, Adam Baum. Adam, we appreciate you coming on and filling in for John for a time that I know for you is very busy, especially with Xavier being on the bubble and the responsibilities and fun that you're going to have the next week. I'm sure there's a lot on your plate.
No, I appreciate the invite, man. You're someone that's out there grinding, and I certainly respect that. This is long overdue, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I appreciate that. Just another episode of General is long overdue. It's been a couple of weeks. John, I'm not sure how much he'll be on. He got himself a real job now for a minor with a minor league baseball team. So I think
Oh,
for
that's cool.
postseason play, it is pretty cool. But for postseason play, it'll most likely just be me. Adam, we'll get into obviously the basketball in a little bit and the Big East preview and everything going on. First, I want to talk about just your experience. You've obviously been around Xavier basketball for a very long time. You wrote for the Cincinnati Enquirer for a while. And then I think it was a couple of years ago in the offseason, you stepped away from Enquirer and had a new opportunity. And it was with this 1831 Media, and you started the Sean Miller podcast. Obviously, one of the producers had a heavy hand in the new All In docuseries that happened this year and just concluded a couple of nights ago. So, what was that first experience stepping away and starting this 1831 media company?
Honestly, it was pretty terrifying. I spent 16 years at the Enquirer, and it was like a part of me thought that I would just do that forever.
Yeah.
And so when I made the decision to leave, I kind of took like a quote unquote corporate job. I was still writing, but it was marketing. It just so happened that the guy who owned the marketing company I met through Xavier, Anthony Breen, and he had this idea to start a media network. And the thing that he wanted to start it with was the Sean Miller podcast. So, when I left the Enquirer, it was kind of like it was bittersweet in the sense that I didn't want to completely leave behind sports and like being involved in sports. It's always been super fun for me. So when he brought that up as a possibility, it was like, all right, yeah, like I'm in. Why not? My biggest concern was getting Sean to actually do it.
Right.
And once it became clear that he wanted to do it and he was interested and kind of invested in it, it just became something where it was like, hey, let's do this, let's have fun, let's see where it goes. And then along the way, it was like, okay, now Paul Fritzner's here. And now we had Josh Semsrott. And, it's like each step along the way, it's kind of led to the next thing. And it's been pretty cool to watch like this random idea, like, hey, we're going to start a podcast with Sean Miller, to kind of watch what it's morphed into.
Yeah, you kind of led me into my next point. I don't think there are 360 Division One basketball coaches who would do what Sean Miller is doing with his podcast. I'm not sure there are even 100, but with the personality and he seems like he's always kind of ahead of the curve and new changing fields and everything like that. What's been working with him like to get this podcast started? I mean, you talked about that was one of your biggest worries. You didn't know how on board he would be. It seems right now, at least, early in the season, and then a little bit as we got later in the season and started winning more games, that there's been a decent amount of episodes pumped out, even in season.
Yeah, I mean, him buying in initially was kind of like, okay, what is this going to be like? What is it going to look like? Who are we going to have on as guests? And I think once we got into it and he saw the workflow and the organizational side of things, I think it put his mind at ease in a way where he actually started to have ideas for shows to, oh, what if we had this guy on, or what if we did, those, we've done a lot of these film room episodes where it's just Sean and it's just a Xavier player. That was his idea, right? Like we didn't tell him like, hey, what if you do this? So I think that has been a positive in the grand scheme of things where, when you have your marquee host, like the guy the show is named after, when he's actually interested and invested in how we're going to do this and what we're going to do. I think, it's never like we're fighting him. Now, there are times, right, like during the season where the last thing he wants to do is sit down and record a podcast. I mean, I can distinctly remember earlier this year, back in December, when they were kind of, Zach was hurt and banged up, and it was unclear if he was going to come back. And They lose the crosstown shootout. They lose at UConn in overtime. They lose to Marquette at home, where it's he doesn't really want to sit down and record a podcast. He wants to work on figuring this team out, trying to make things right. And those are moments where it's like, okay, we completely understand that. That should be your focus right now. So we're gonna kind of maybe we'll work around that. Maybe me and Paul will just do some episodes, which we've done. But it's been cool to like see Sean's like his progression in this too, right? Like the way that he's kind of taken ownership of this thing that's named after him. It's not at all like, oh, he's just showing up, checking a box, and he doesn't really care about the finished product. He cares deeply, which I think goes a long way in the finished product.
Yeah, I think you can tell a little bit too, especially as the podcast has gone on, that he seems to, put a little bit of put a little bit more, care into it than I think maybe people expected at the beginning. But I mean, you brought up an interesting point about you get to the middle of the season and that there's struggles like this. Not only is I'm sure Sean not very like doesn't it's not his biggest priority to record a podcast. I know there are also fans that if your team's on a 4 game losing streak, I don't know if they want to see their coach on a hosting a podcast a couple times a week. But I think it's given you guys a pretty interesting storyline, and the season's gone on. And now that they've won 7 in a row, 12 of the last 15 to end a year. Is that something that you could have even predicted? And how nice, how kind of cool is it to see that storyline take place, especially thinking back to where you were in the middle of the year?
I mean, yeah, there were moments in the middle of the year where we were wondering, like, are people going to care if this team just, falls off a cliff and they don't turn it around, right? Like, what is this show going to look like? And, I think to all of our credits, right, like to power through that and to not get really bogged down in those type of thoughts and just say, okay, like we have a job to do today. It's to document a season regardless of what happens with this team. And then what's been really fun, right? Like we just published episode 8 today, and I told Josh, our editor, director, it's pretty much the only piece of college basketball content that I think I've ever consumed that really depicts what it's like for a team that's on the bubble fighting to make the NCAA tournament.
Mhm.
So it's like, rewind the clock 2 months, 2.5 months. It's like we're wondering how are we going to do this? And now it's like things have progressed and evolved in a way where it's really been perfect from a storytelling perspective. And I'm really excited to see what happens this week because I think it'll be a really cool finished product if this is a team that was like, for all intents and purposes, at one time 9-7, kind of left for dead in the college basketball space, and they're knocking on the door for the NCAA tournament.
Well, again, I think it goes back to I think that this is one of the best teams to do it with. If you take other teams who have been in a similar spot because of, Sean Miller's willingness to do all this and one thing that stood out to me is you could tell in the last couple of episodes, and I think you can tell in the pressers a little bit. Dalen Swain had a quote a while back that really piqued my interest. A lot of times, teams in these situations, they're acting like they have no idea what's going on. They're just going out there winning games. This Xavier team hasn't taken this approach, and you can tell these guys know. Obviously, Sean Miller, but even the players like know what's at stake in each game and know what needs to be done. So I think that's what makes it so interesting about this team. And I don't know if there's anything else kind of in that area, or if that's what you've seen with this team that makes this team a little different to do a show like that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think like if you're a fan of Xavier, if you're a fan of college basketball, right? Like what more would you want to see from a team that's very much fighting for its life, right? You want to see them show up and understand the gravity of the situation and know that their back is firmly against the wall and then go play like it. And I think if anything, like to this team's credit, they've done that and we've had the opportunity to document it. And I think like circumstances, if they were a little different, if Xavier didn't have one of the more experienced rosters in the country and
Yeah.
knowing what this program went through just a year ago with injuries and trying to fill holes at the last minute with European guys, it's like I think this team, I think you're right, was like, if you're going to make a show like this, that this was a team that was kind of built to be able to handle that and withstand that. But we definitely heard it throughout the season from the fan base, right? Like, I could go through my Twitter mentions. There were a lot of, hey, turn the cameras off, and man, maybe you guys should stop podcasting with Sean Miller right now. So I think to your point, right? Like that was a part of it too.
Probably got a lot of fans talking or asking you why you weren't able to put in $1 beer night or or free T-shirts for the whiteout too, right?
Yeah, we got a lot of those tweets as well.
But shifting a little bit to the basketball side, yeah, we touched on a little bit how the season's gone. This Big East tournament coming up, obviously this game against Marquette's a huge one. A lot of people calling it a win and in. I mean, this time it just depends so much on what happens around you with bid thieves. Ohio State losing today was huge. So Xavier hasn't even played a game yet, and they already got a big win today with that Iowa win over Ohio
Hmm.
State. And then also, it is now a two quad one win Xavier team with UConn moving into the
Yep.
top 30. Don't know like if that'll last and anything like that, but that's just how the intricacies of the net and the new selection process coming into this game. You're playing a Marquette team that you split with, but played pretty well against both times this year. The loss was at home without Zach Freemantle on a questionable call or a questionable no call at the end of the game. How confident are you in just what do you like about this matchup with Marquette?
Well, I think you saw it more the second time they met at Marquette. What I like about this is really what Xavier figured out in that meeting in Milwaukee. And one of the things that they did, which I think you're going to see them do again tomorrow, is they did like this thing defensively with their matchups. And they essentially are taking Davion McKnight, Xavier's point guard, and they're matching him up with Marquette's center, Ben Gold.
Mhm.
Now, Ben Gold is a center, but the way they use him is more like a guard. So he's very much perimeter oriented. They don't really post him up and high low it and feed him on that low block. So that's kind of not a concern for Xavier by putting a much smaller guy on him. And then the other thing they do is they take Zach Freemantle or they take John Hughley or Jerome Hunter and they put their big on Stevie Mitchell, Marquette's guard. And this worked really well in the first matchup, or the matchup in Milwaukee. So I think that they learned a lot from that. They learned that, hey, there's this thing that we can do with our lineups that we think really benefits us. And I think you're going to see them try that again tomorrow. But the bottom line is like, I think for Xavier, knowing how well they're playing, knowing that they've had success against Marquette, and knowing that that this is very much like the same situation that Xavier has been in now for the last 6 weeks, where you got to win games, you got to beat quality teams, and that's the opportunity tomorrow at Madison Square Garden for a lot of these guys. Like Zach hasn't had a crazy amount of success when he's on the court in Madison Square Garden in the Big East tournament, so there's a lot riding on this for a lot of these guys on Xavier's roster, and to this point they've kind of thrived under that pressure. So I think if you're a Xavier fan, those are the things that you really like about this matchup. It's also, you know, Marquette in Madison Square Garden is a lot different than playing UConn in Madison Square Garden. If they would have gotten UConn, it would have been an away game, arena filled with UConn fans. It'll be a lot different against Marquette tomorrow.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too. I mean, you said it perfectly. The thing that I like most about it is just the matchups, and I think somewhere that Xavier struggled a bit this year is sometimes post defense. Well, Marquette, like
Hmm.
they don't really like Ben Gold is their five, but I would like not call him a center. Like they do not have any bigs. They're not a back to the basket team by any means. The flip side of that is where Xavier struggles defensively in the post. That's where they might be the best offensively. And again, I
Yeah,
don't. Ben Gold, I'll take that matchup on Zach Freemantle if you're Freemantle for almost any other uh, perimeter or post team in the Big East. So I think again, I mean, you're coming down the stretch, and it's like, all right, it looked like for a while it was going to be UConn, and another team that I think Xavier matches up with decently well. But again, you brought it up the fans and everything in the stands. It makes it a whole different
it's
ball.
different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's also a Marquette team that doesn't shoot the three ball real well. And I think
No, that's a great point. And that helps too, right? Marquette, like if I had to describe the way they want to play and the way they want to attack, they want to get downhill and they want to drive the basketball and they want to make twos at the rim. Um, And the way that Xavier defends, right? Like they play this pack line defense, they're going to try to tighten the court up. And that you're not daring Marquette to make threes, but you're saying like, hey, we're not going to let you guys just drive the basketball at will and finish through contact for 2 points. Like you're gonna have to kick it out. We're gonna have to close out, put a hand in your face, and if you make it, you make it. But that that's really to me what this game is going to come down to.
I think, if I don't have the numbers pulled up, but go back to that game that Xavier won at Marquette. They did not shoot well at all, especially from three. It was either one or two made
No.
threes throughout the entire game, which is the lowest that Xavier's had this year, and especially the last 7 games of the 7 game win streak. They have shot the three ball really well. So I think that's another promising thing is it's not like Marquette's perimeter defense was awesome and Xavier just wasn't getting good looks. That was just a game they weren't shooting well, and they were still able to hold on. Another part of that game, honestly, the biggest thing that sticks out is Marquette was like one of the best teams in the country at not turning the ball over, and Xavier turned them over a lot. I thought that was a pretty interesting part, but that's what the Xavier defense does. They jump passes, very anticipatory. Do you see that being a factor again, or was that just a fluke from Marquette?
I do. And honestly, I think that Xavier's gotten better at it since that last meeting in Milwaukee, right? That was early to mid January. I would argue that the last 4 weeks, Xavier's become far more disruptive on defense in terms of like live ball turnovers leading to runouts, Dalen Swain dunks, all those things. The other thing you mentioned was how poorly Xavier shot it in that win at Marquette.
Mhm.
Ryan Conwell was basically a non factor in that
Yeah.
game. And you could argue, it's really between him and Fremantle, but Conwell, the way that he's played these last 4 games, right? Like I would expect him to be a very different player from the last time these two teams met.
That's another interesting storyline coming into the game. I remember you go all the way back to the first game between these two teams at Cintas, which was right before the Seton Hall game. Connell had struggled in that 3 game losing streak. He had a good game at Cincinnati in the second half, but he had his
Hmm.
struggles and played really poorly at the first game against Marquette at home. And I remember once he finally broke out in that Seton Hall game, Sean Miller had a big comment about how frustrated he was after those couple of games, especially the Marquette game. That was the first time around. Second time around, even though Xavier got the win, you mentioned it, Ryan Conwell didn't have his best game in that one either. So you start to wonder if it's a matchup thing or a confidence thing. But that's another one that maybe could potentially be a worry if you're a Xavier fan. But I don't know. What do you make of Conwell against Marquette?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something to be concerned about the fact that he's played them twice and he hasn't necessarily found it the way he has more often than not the rest of this season.
Right.
But like that's also kind of an ace up Xavier's sleeve. If Conwell can get it going and he knocks down some shots on the perimeter, what ultimately does that do for Xavier, in my opinion? Is it helps soften things up for Zach Fremantle down low.
Yeah.
And if Conwell can get it going on the perimeter, it gives them another thing to worry about. It maybe takes some pressure off of their ability to collapse on Zach when he gets the ball around the basket. If that's a one-on-one matchup between Ben Gold and Zach Fremantle, I really like Zach Fremantle's chances. So to me, this is a game where it's really going to be beneficial for Xavier if they can have the outside and the inside game going, which is something that they didn't have the last time these two teams met.
Yeah. Well, I think looking at either of those 2 games, one of the biggest things you point out is just the defense in general, especially the second game with a win. Dalen Swain was a huge part of that. I mean, he was guarding Cam Jones, who one of the best guards in the Big East, best scoring guards in the Big East, the first team All Big East member a couple days ago. So he covered Cam Jones for a good chunk of that game, and this is again a Xavier team where Swain's been great defensively. Marcus Foster has stepped up defensively. Coming into the year, I don't know if I don't think I was the only one who thought this, but when you see the personnel that they got out of the transfer portal and everything, and with the guys that you knew coming back and had experience, it didn't feel like a team that was going to be on what are we, March 12th, ranked higher on KenPom defensively than they are offensively. I think that's been one of the most interesting developments this year.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think, I remember in the preseason watching this team practice, talking to people at Xavier, Xavier fans, the thing I said more than anything was like, this team's going to score a lot of points. I never talked to anyone about their defense, and they've really become a team that can win basketball games with their defense. So that was an unexpected development from this team, but it's one of those things where if you really followed their season, you can see the way that they've improved at that end of the floor. And now it's something that I think that they almost depend on, that they count on, that they say, look, we have enough offensively. People have to deal with our defense. We're going to beat you with our defense, and they're going to need it against Marquette. I think Marquette's a team that can score the basketball. So, yeah, the defensive end of the floor has definitely been the most surprising thing of the year for me, for Xavier.
All right, if we go off the court, just the optics of everything. You're someone who's around the team a lot, obviously. Just knowing, again, going back to the fact that a lot of these players know what's at stake in this game, know exactly, their chances if they win the game, their chances if they lose the game. Do you think that's something that benefits this team, or do you think it could hurt them get inside their heads? I mean, this is what, the second most experienced team in college basketball. Do you think that the reason, I mean, you kind of touched on it, but the reason that they can handle it better is because of that experience?
I think that certainly helps. I also think if you're wondering how it's going to affect them now,
Mhm.
like they've kind of been in this situation. I talked about it earlier that this is nothing new for them. It's not like they backed their way into this position where it's like, okay, guys, we lost five out of the last six, and now we're on the bubble, and we have to go to Madison Square Garden and win games. No, this team was 14-10 after they lost at Villanova in early February, and they knew full well, hey, we better win the rest of our regular season games if we want to have a chance to make the NCAA tournament. And they did that. So I think that they're a team that experience certainly helps. And like they've played their way into this position in a positive way. They haven't backed into it. So that's kind of the way I think about this team and where they're at right now is that I don't think the moment is going to get to them because they've been dealing with this moment for the last 6 weeks.
When this is posted, this game's going out, or this game will tip today at 2:30 after the St. John's Butler game, after Butler won earlier today. Um, Again, kind of off the court. I mean, everyone's been hearing about the chances if they win this game, chances if they lose this game, and so much of it's affected by bid thieves and other bubble teams. But right now, I mean, where does your take on exactly how much this game means, and scenarios if they win or if they lose this game?
Yeah, I mean, right now, really, the only knock that anyone has against Xavier is that quad one win total.
Yeah.
Some or Thursday afternoon at Madison Square Garden, Marquette is top 50 in the net. It's a neutral game, so it's a quad one opportunity. And if as you mentioned earlier, right, like they picked up a second quad one win overnight, which is always interesting. And I
What
have to think that was
I was just
that
going
was
to
Gonzaga.
it's a UConn team that is one has been hot recently. So you'd like to think
Yes,
playing at home, basically playing at home now at Madison Square Garden, hopefully
they're
they
gonna,
get a
yeah.
couple of wins. I mean, that can keep that at the top 30, but go ahead.
Yeah, that would definitely be helpful from Xavier's perspective. But um, yeah, I think like win tomorrow, and I think you're feeling really good,
Yeah.
right? And especially because like you watch some of these other teams that are on the bubble, who they're done now, like in Ohio State. So I think win tomorrow, you're feeling pretty good. Lose to Marquette, and it's going to be a nervous, 48 or so hours, just because if you're one of those teams that basically bracket matrix or all the bracketologists have penciled into the last four, what you're banking on is there being no bid thieves.
Yeah.
If you're in the last four in and there's four bid thieves, guess what? You're not an NCAA tournament team. You're going to get kicked out. So I do think like winning tomorrow, you give yourself a chance um, to maybe get out of that last four in line and maybe one of the last four buys, and then you're feeling a little bit better.
Yeah, so I think like one of the things that I was looking at specifically too, I remember each of the last five NCAA tournaments, and it probably goes beyond that, but since bracket matrix has become a huge thing, every single year there is one team that people don't really expect to make the tournament, that makes it over a team that people really thought was going to make the tournament. And
Yep.
like it has been consistent on Bracket Matrix the last 5 years that they got one team in terms of who's in, who's out. They got one team wrong each of the last 5 years. And what I try to do is I try to go look at and find trends on what those teams are and what about their resumes are similar to the other teams that got left out. There's really nothing. I think that one of the biggest complaints about the selection committee is that it's just been a little inconsistent the last few years, and now you're using the whole net as a sorting tool, but not necessarily as a ranking. But then when you hear arguments, then you hear net rankings brought up. So I think that's another really interesting part that like more than ever at this time of the year, this year it feels like coming into today, I have no idea what happens after Ohio State's loss, but coming into Tuesday or to Wednesday, the gap between Ohio State or Xavier as that last team in, and like North Carolina or Boise State as that first team out, on March 12th every year, there's usually not that wide of a gap in the consensus belief. So I just wonder if, there being that gap already, if the bracket matrix is going to have that this year where they get a team wrong and someone that people completely don't expect makes it.
No, that's a great point. And the other thing that's really interesting to me in the timing of how this happened is we talked about UConn becoming a quad one win for Xavier, and that happened overnight, Tuesday night into Wednesday morning. And the only thing I can think of is UConn beat Gonzaga. Gonzaga beat St. Mary's on Tuesday night. But the interesting thing about the timing is that the NCAA tournament selection committee, I believe they met for the first time today on March 12th. And in that first meeting, right, like the first time they're all in the room, they're sitting down, they're talking about the field, they're actually voting on at-large teams.
Yeah.
They sit down, and Xavier doesn't have one quad one win; they have two.
Yeah.
So that was interesting timing for me. Perfect timing if you're Xavier, right? That the first time that they're all in the room, they're talking about a two quad one win team, not a one. It's not nothing, you know.
Yeah. And I think too, a point that I brought up, and as much as the selection committee likes to say that this is never a part of it, I mean, the selection committee they're humans. They're watching games. I think everything that's not on a team sheet favors Xavier. I think the way that they're playing right now, and
Correct.
last 5, 7 games this season, I think eye test right now. I think there's a pretty good argument that Xavier's been uh, passing the eye test in the eyes of a lot of people who watch college basketball. And again, back to the way they're playing, Xavier fans have been on the bubble a lot, and they know this so much from being on the bubble after trending down in the season. For once, they're
Mm-hmm.
trending up on the bubble, and I think that's another one of the few trends I found between teams who unexpectedly did make the tournament last 5 years. So they're teams that maybe didn't have the strongest resume, but were playing better at the end of the year, as opposed to other teams that are really, just fighting hard to not play themselves off the bubble. So I think that's another thing that favors Xavier. I just don't know how much that's actually looked at.
No, I would hope like the human aspect of it, you're absolutely right in that, if I'm sitting there and I'm trying to pick who's an NCAA tournament team and I've got all these resumes and I look at it and I say, okay, this team's won seven in a row, maybe eight in a row at the right time at the end of the year. Like it's going to be hard for me to ignore that as a human being and say, okay, I can't just look at recency bias. I have to look at the whole total. But in the back of your head, you're thinking, yeah, this is a team that's trying to play their way in rather than stumble down the stretch and hope that they make it. So to me, it's not nothing, you know.
No, I 100% agree. I think it's just things that we've seen in the last few years. But obviously, don't want to get ahead of yourself for that Marquette game. But let's say they do win Marquette. Hopefully, I think if they win tomorrow, we'll have another podcast up before the what would should be St. John's game. They'll play Butler at noon today. Um, you're playing St. John's in the Big East tournament at Madison Square Garden. I mean, is that the most uphill battle in the world, or is there some silver lining anywhere?
No, I mean it's an uphill battle. There's no way around it. I remember last year Xavier played. They beat Butler on Wednesday. They played UConn at noon on Thursday and lost. I stayed another day and I watched UConn play St. John's in the semis at MSG, and it was bar none, arguably the best environment of any college basketball game that I attended last year. A big part of that was UConn St. John's in the Garden, but like knowing what St. John's has accomplished this year and the way that this city has really rallied around them, like it's going to be a hostile environment for whoever plays St. John's on Friday at MSG. And if it's Xavier, you know, it'll be interesting to see how they handle that and how they deal with it because they just played St. John's at Madison Square Garden
Yeah.
in January, and they built a 16-point lead and watched it evaporate. So
Well, you're just hoping that they're in the tournament at that point, heading into that St. John's game. But I mean, they've
that's
shown
true.
they can come into Madison Square Garden and play well. They did it, obviously, like you talked about before, blowing the 16-point lead, and that was a game that I think Sean Miller had one of his many famous quotes where he's talking about the really bad day from the bench. But Adam, I won't keep you too long. I appreciate you coming on. I know you got to get some rest before 4 games tomorrow. You'll be there, obviously. I'll be there as well at Madison Square
Can't
Garden.
wait.
Tip off coming up at 2:30 against Marquette. Adam, appreciate you coming on.